Thank you so much for joining me this afternoon. It's good to be with you. My name, as you'll have gathered by now, is Joshua Kellard, and I am sending my greetings from Edinburgh, which is where I live with my family. My wife and I are blessed to have 3 children who are all quite young. So we are fairly new in our home educating journey. Our eldest is approaching 5, then we have a 2.5-year-old, and we have an approaching 1-year-old. So it's a real delight to be here at Learn Free for the first time. I'm just going to charge straight in really with the theme that we have, which is a truth depth charge. Is it time for a parents' pact? And just to sculpt the session a little bit and our expectations, I'm hoping to speak for no longer than about 35 minutes. And then I'd really be keen to discuss things with you and to hear from your experience and your wisdom, and to enjoy something of a dialogue. So if you do have questions, feel free to leave them in the chat. I have to confess, I'm not very good at multitasking, so I may not get to them until the end. But I'm hoping that by allowing a long chunk of time for discussion, we can get to all of those questions and also no doubt suggestions and ideas. So I'll get to the depth charge bit in a little bit, but essentially, who is this session for? Well, I think it will be of interest to those who are concerned by the encroachment of the state in the lives of children and families. It will also be of interest to those who are committed to the idea that it is parents, mothers and fathers, who their primary responsibility for their children, for their upbringing and education, and who believe that that entails that they be free to discharge that responsibility. So there are 3 sections. Sorry about the controls, the erratic controls there. 3 sections to my presentation. The first one is the state we're in. So we'll be looking at some of the ways in which the UK state is currently seeking to interact with children and families. Then we'll look briefly at the responsibilities we have as parents. That will be part B of the why of a Parents' Pact. And then finally, we'll consider some of the options before us. And I'll be making the case for a civil society approach to maintaining freedoms. So without further ado, I thought it best to give you a little introduction to myself by way of just signaling some of the sources of my own views on this subject. So I'm really glad to be part of a conference that is, it's in a sense welcoming people of all faiths and none to discuss issues of home education. But my views on this have certainly been influenced by my own faith. So I'll give you a little bit of a heads up on that by way of intellectual honesty and candid sharing with you. So I'm a Christian, and I'm a Christian committed to something called sphere sovereignty, which is, like all Christians, my confession is that Christ is Lord, and yet he has delegated and distributed his authority in various ways within the created realm. So there's the civil magistracy, the government, we might say, the state. There's the family, which has a measure of authority and responsibility. There's the academy and everything that goes on in the sphere of learning and science. There are the arts, and there's the media. And all of these are spheres, if you like, which have their own sovereignty. They have their own delegated responsibilities. And as such, it's tragic if one of these spheres begins to encroach on another of them and take its prerogatives. So you may recognize this in other forms, because it's not an exclusively Christian idea. There are different versions of it. But I wanted to highlight for you some of my own worldview commitments and where this comes from for me, so you can be informed, and that can hopefully feed into our discussion later. That being said, this is a presentation for everyone, as I've mentioned, who's interested in these things, and I'd be keen to hear how your own worldview influences how you think about and how you relate to this question of the state and the family as well. Now, a hugely influential thinker for me is Abraham Kuyper, who may be a person unknown to you. He was a politician in the Netherlands in the 19th century. And I can't actually see the quote on this slide because my screen has been invaded by different windows that I can't click out of, but hopefully you can see the essence of Kuyper's thinking on sphere sovereignty. Essentially, it's the idea that I just mentioned, that there are a variety of spheres that are precious, that are independent, and we flourish and we thrive when we observe the boundaries of the different spheres as they relate to each other. And of course, that is the essential background and foreground for discussing the state and the family and how we begin to think about home education and its independence or otherwise. So that's a little bit of a personal introduction by way of worldview, by way of the presuppositions, you might say, I bring to the table. But nevertheless, I think what's being realized in the home ed community increasingly is that wherever we stand in terms of our worldview commitments, whether we're humanists, whether we are Muslims, Jews, Christians, or those who simply have no faith and may describe themselves in a different way, having committed ourselves to the upbringing of our children, the education of our children, the formation of our children, we're beginning to realize that the tide is turning in terms of the way the state wants to relate to us. And so it's time to talk about these big issues in a new way with a new attentiveness and fervor. So first up then, the state we're in. The state is mutating and morphing in various ways, and we've seen that most recently, of course, in particular through the COVID years and the various things that have been done in the public sphere. But let's focus in on education. Let's briefly touch on 3 of the 4 nations of the UK and consider some of the most recent developments in terms of educational freedom. So those who didn't catch Randall Hardy's excellent presentation this morning at 11:30, if you want to hear more about what's covered on this slide, I do want to signpost you to what he's presented this morning, which is fantastic. And in fact, much of what I'm going to say is the fruit of my discussions with Randall. But we had the schools bill last year, which is an interesting bill because on the one hand, it dealt with schools and academies, hence the name. But on the other hand, it sought also to address home education in a far more comprehensive way, perhaps, than previous legislation has. In my view, it formed a sort of pincer movement because the government made a move against independent schools, particularly informal schools, outside of its remit, seeking to tighten the legal framework within which such schools could operate. So in a sense, it was seeking to regulate more the life of schools and academies. The other claw of the pincer, however, as it sought to define what counts as suitable education, was its approach to home education. In particular, the introduction of a register for children not in schools. This movement towards the omniscience of the state, in one sense, as to what is going on for every child in the country. It wants to know, it wants to be able to have a case file on every single child to ensure 2 things. Number 1, that each child is properly safeguarded. And number 2, to ensure that each child receives a suitable education. Now, the schools bill failed, interestingly, not because of particularly compelling opposition, although there were some admirable speeches against it in the House of Lords, but really, it seems because of political vicissitudes. And we must remember this. The schools bill didn't fail in a sense on its own merits or because of any grand educational demonstration or compelling opposition. It failed largely because of the upheaval of the autumn. Now we've got a slightly different tool being brought in the wake of the failure of the schools bill with Flick Drummond MP's 10-minute rule bill from last week. And I really do suggest that for some in-depth treatment of this, you consult Randall's presentation earlier. But essentially, it is unlikely this bill will receive a second reading, or if it does in the autumn, that it will go through to the subsequent stage. But it seems it is being used as a lobbying piece, essentially, to raise awareness of the issue and to try and poke the government into introducing a bill of its own. Very briefly then, moving on to talk about Wales, in a sense, Wales ought to have been dealt with first, because it is in Wales that we have perhaps the most alarming encroachment on the freedom of families to educate. In particular, a new statutory package which has been released just in the last week, which puts the onus and the legal responsibility on local authorities to ensure a suitable education is being given to children. And it would involve, as part of its recommendations, an insistence that essentially local authority personnel visit each home educated family in order to speak directly with each home educated child to ascertain whether or not they are, in the eyes of the local authority, receiving a suitable education. So unprecedented access being granted on a legal footing to the state to relate to families. Finally, Scotland. Scotland's where I live. Scotland has an uneasy relationship with the family. I think it's fair to say that. So Scotland was the first of the nations of the UK to introduce a scheme that would have appointed a state representative effectively for every child, a state agent who could operate over the heads of parents, ostensibly for the well-being of the child, but all the time as a representative of the state and the state's interpretation of that child's well-being and rights. I don't know what your views on smacking are. In a sense, it's immaterial, because I just want to highlight that the smacking ban of 2020 was unprecedented in terms of its role in shaping what had hitherto been regarded as the family's sovereign territory. You know, it was for parents to decide how best to discipline their children. Well, that changed in Scotland in 2020 when the state made clear its own perspective on modes of discipline. So something else that's different in Scotland is that the health visitor pathway is particularly muscular in Scotland. Multiple visits from health visitors are standard now in Scotland, even when there seems to be very little health benefit derived from such visits. And it is termed the health surveillance scheme. Now, having moved from England to Scotland, that was a real shock to my wife and I to realize we weren't being given the choice of not having these visits. It was assumed that these were mandatory. And so there is an air here in Scotland of unease, of a blurring of the boundaries between what it is appropriate for the state to ask of families and what really ought to be parents and families' own prerogatives. Currently, we're in a bit of a lull when it comes to home education and the freedom of families, because the most recent guidance was inconclusive in its recommendations. Sorry, when I say guidance, what I mean is the results of a consultation last summer. Guidance is now being developed, but highlighted in the government's response to the consultation was a desire for positive relationships between local authorities and home educators. Now, the desire, of course, for this relationship is rather one-sided. It's on the part of the local authority. So it's a bit like one of those awkward teenage relationships, really, where one person's keener on the other than the other is on them. A belief is evident in what the government published that the local authority is the primary data controller. Now, that's an interesting designation because presumably that comes with rights. And finally, the feedback on the consultation question on a national register encouragingly noted a variety of response. So some people pushed back in quite a significant way against that idea. But we can't trust to the Scottish state to uphold necessarily the freedoms and the independence of families. We are in the calm. It remains to be seen what sort of storm will follow this calm, but it is likely to be taking notice of developments in England and in Wales. I've been far too long with that than I intended. Let me just flag up the fact, though, that what we are facing is renewed and sustained attempts to ready families for a greater involvement with local authorities, an attempt to normalize heavy local authority contact with home educating families. And it's useful to recall the words of Baroness Hale, which came as she ruled on the named person scheme in 2016. She said, the first thing that a totalitarian regime tries to do is to get at the children, to distance them from the subversive, varied influences of their families and indoctrinate them in their ruler's view of the world. Within limits, families must be left to bring up their children in their own way. I'm sure you'll agree, a key quote for us to go back to and meditate on in the current climate. So part two, as we have seen, the state wants to be more involved with us. What about our responsibilities when we reflect on them? Well, fear not, this is not going to be a lecture on parental responsibilities, but let's just briefly consider some of the things parents can do that the state can't. First of all, parents can produce children. The state still hasn't figured out how to bypass us in that process. A simple point, but perhaps worth thinking about. The state can't provide for children. In that, of course, the state's resources are taxpayer resources, ultimately. And the state's power, the state's muscularity is therefore always dependent on the acquiescence of the people. The state can't provide for children on a variety of levels either, not simply in economical terms, but in relational terms. The state can't love children. It is extremely hard for departments to love those in their care. We love on an interpersonal basis. Parents can, of course. The state doesn't sacrifice for children. The state runs, the state hums along, the state pursues its policies and goals. But unlike parents who day in and day out have to sacrifice for their children and do so a lot of the time with joy, and even when they're not particularly joyful, nevertheless do sacrifice for their children, the state is not in a position to do that. And no matter how good educational provision is for children, the state can never play the primary role in the formation of children. An awful lot of this happens in the context of the home, even for school-educated children. We have to be mindful of that. Even the most comprehensive state offerings for education inevitably fall short because of the structure of the family, the sovereignty, you might say, of the family in this realm. And then the state can't protect children. And of course, many people are doing very good work showing some of the concerning trends in school-based education, the ways in which our children are not being protected. And families, of course, can protect children. And that is not to say that every family does. And it is also not to say that the state never has a proper reason for being involved with the family. But it is to say, on a very general level, the state cannot do these things for children. Parents alone can. And by extension, extended families, kinship networks, and slightly further extension, local communities. These are the institutions, the relationships that children need most, and in which children can contribute the most as well. Now, our home life, just to clarify, for those who are wondering, we don't live in a cottage like this. This is a somewhat idealized picture of home life. So the options before us, I wonder if we could have just engage in a thought experiment for a minute or two. If the worst happened, I don't know where you might be, perhaps you're in England, Northern Ireland, Wales, or Scotland, perhaps somewhere else, and you're tuning in. But if the worst happened in your context, what would you do? If tomorrow you became aware of the local authorities' interest in your child because officials were knocking at your door asking to interview them, if you were being told to add your child's name to a government case file on their education and upbringing, on the soundness and suitability of it, if you were asked to provide samples of their work out of the blue, if you were asked to report with them to an educational bureau, if the worst happened, if the absolutely worst legislation were passed in your part of the UK or part of the world, what would you do? I mean, it strikes me that broadly speaking, there are there are two modes of response. The first is that we cut our losses and try and coexist with the new demands. We register our children and tell ourselves, well, it can't be all that bad. You know, these are responsible government people after all. We put up with what are effectively enforced visits, just hoping that we can satisfy the inspector's criteria. That's the path of least resistance. But might you take a different path? Might you say, actually, no, for me, this is a red line in terms of my family's freedom to develop naturally, my children's freedom to develop their potential. This is a red line in terms of how I understand my responsibilities as a parent as well. Now, in a sense, I've got really nothing to say if the first option is what you'd opt to do. In a sense, there isn't much to say. I suppose you just go along with it. But if for you, any of these measures would be a red flag, then what could we consider doing by way of response? If political and legal redress doesn't work, in other words, do we have a recourse as a community? Now, first of all, a word, and I'm going to lean a little bit on my Christian faith in this slide. I want to suggest that politics is important, but it is not utterly crucial. It is not the last word in terms of the life of a people. Have a look here. I think Psalm 146 verse 3 has wisdom on this score. It says, "Put not your trust in princes, in the Son of Man in whom there is no salvation." We might update that to say, don't lean exclusively on the political process. Don't trust to the integrity of departments. And I think it points us to the fact also that politics is downstream of culture. Politics is where our public life surfaces and becomes legally binding, but it is not the full extent of our life as a people. Now, that is much more subtle, it's harder to define, and thankfully it's much more diffused among these various spheres of influence. Politics wants us to believe that it is the first and last word on any given issue. And as a result, we tend as a people, I think, to embrace the idea of what Francis Schaeffer, a philosopher of the last century, called sociological law. We tend to believe that whatever is passed in the latest guidance, or whatever is passed by a given department or given statutory instrument, then becomes the way we must organize our lives. But that's a fragile basis for our common life. And it would have been perilous, for example, if at various points in history, people had taken that to be the case. Politics is a futile basis also for rights. What I mean by that is, if our rights are granted to us by the state, then our rights can be taken away by the state. If our rights are purely sociological, then they really have no firm or lasting foundation. So what we need to do is to cultivate, I would suggest, a concept of rights which relies on a higher law, a moral law, and appeal to that as we engage in the political sphere, but also bear in mind that the political sphere is not the final stage. It's not ultimate. We have to be aware, we have to beware of being eaten and consumed by the political process and its urgency. Because of course, that's the aim of the game. If you are a state which aspires to be dominating every sphere of society, then it is useful to cultivate the idea that politics is the be-all and end-all of all things. If you're a state, however, that has a much more limited, a much more focused role, then you can allow room for civil society. So I don't want to suggest that we abandon all legal processes and all political lobbying. Far from it. We must continue with that. But I believe what we need is civil society realism. We need to believe that the civil sphere, the life of our people, is more real than the life of our governors. And that, I believe, points us to an interesting idea. And the idea has been tried before in different contexts, and it's the idea of a civil covenant. Now, My claim would be that our great need as home educators and more broadly as citizens is for us to recognize, to embrace, to practice in our lives, and then to communicate to others eventually the responsibilities and rights that we already have, our natural rights, as it were, not those bestowed by a generous state. If that's true, then one way that we could move towards being able to do that more effectively is perhaps a parents' pact. This would be, perhaps, could be a document that stands outside of the political process. So it's not a petition. It's not something that is accountable to the state and that just gets ignored, but it's something that we primarily write for ourselves. It's a commitment to one another, and it involves a statement of the responsibilities we understand ourselves to have already, and a commitment to defending those responsibilities as well. Now, the elements of a pact could be, I don't want to get too detailed, but it could be, I'll just focus on a few things here, a declaration of our responsibility of parents, just declaring those rights which we already understand to be ours. Alongside that, a highlighting of the limits, the necessary limits of the state in relation to our children and our family life. Then, as part of a covenant or a pact, there is agreement between those who sign to unite, to defend one another, and to uphold the principles of freedom that we believe in. And then the last component would be a statement of what could be called civil disobedience. My preferred term for this is principled resistance, because I don't think it's about disobeying legitimate laws. I think it's rather about resisting illegitimate overreach. So, for example, let's think about the schools bill. Let's think about Wales. The covenant or the pact could include statements that pledge ourselves to defending the freedom to not register our children, to not set up government case files on them, to not be complicit in that, to the freedom to not be investigated by the local authority on suspicion that we may not be offering a suitable education, the freedom to resist unfair fines. You remember that the school bill essentially said that parents who resist registration may be fined. They may also be subject to forced school attendance orders on their children. And if they were to, my understanding is that if they were to refuse to submit to those orders, then imprisonment was a real and present threat within the schools bill's recommendations. Really quite an astonishing document when you think that this is being drafted by governors about their people, about the traditionally free sphere of the family. Quite gobsmacking. But a covenant would address that, and it would say, we're carving out an area in which we understand ourselves to be free, and we will defend the freedom that we have, essentially regardless of the consequences, and that we are united in that. So that's the sort of thing that I wonder could be part of a movement if or alongside other efforts in the political sphere and the legal sphere. Now, I mentioned depth charge in the title of this presentation. I'm not sure of how familiar you are with submarine warfare, but of course the theme of our conference is truth bombs. I understand that purely metaphorically. To extend the metaphor of truth bombs that maybe, explode on an individual, bringing insight and bringing revolution in our thinking, I wonder whether the submarine of the state's educational policy couldn't benefit from a few depth charges being dropped in its immediate vicinity. Now, I'm not advocating, of course, violence against government personnel or property. Rather, if you imagine educational policy as a submarine, which I think is quite apt because a lot of it is developed in the recesses of departmental policymaking, then a depth charge of civil society resistance may cause the desired effect in bringing that submarine to a standstill. You may know that a depth charge is essentially an explosive dropped out of a ship, and the first explosion begets a shock wave because of the expansion of the gas resulting from the incendiary material. But then there's a further shockwave because the lack of pressure in the area around the bomb, the water collapses the gas there to create another shockwave as the gas expands again. And you can have these shockwaves just going on and on and on. Now, I may have gone a little bit too far with this analogy, but if civil society can begin to recover some of its muscularity, what you essentially have is a challenge to state power, which may be resisted by the state. There may be a back and forth. There may be some of us who have to pay, who have to undergo some uncomfortable experiences if we stand up to repressive government policy. But the hope is that this sort of approach would eventually win out, perhaps through several waves of change and impact. Do let me know in the discussion in a moment's time if I may have gone a little too far with my illustration there. The final part, and I meant to have a slide for this, is a discussion. I am very much floating this idea in the hopes that I can benefit from some of your wisdom and experience. And so I'm going to head back to our moderator, who I believe is Randall, and I'd be really keen to connect with you in a time of discussion.
Thank you, Joshua. I will unpin you now, and we'll go from there.
Thank you very much.
Right. Gallery.
So,
okay, folks. Joshua, you're here for questions. I'll put my video on as well and encourage others to do the same. If you want to ask questions, whatever, raise your hand, turn your video on, or don't turn your video on. We are still being recorded.
What would be most helpful, Randall, that we look through some of the questions that have been in comments and then go to time of free discussion?
There hasn't been a lot of questions in the comments. There's been a question and answer. Somebody said, is health surveillance mandatory? I presume they meant in Scotland. And Amy replied, yes, my sister moved to Scotland when my nephew was a few months old and found the system very different to the involvement she had from health visitors in England. She found it especially difficult when her first Scottish health visitor was awful.
Yes.
And Ruth said, wise lady. And then Ruth liked your term, principled resistance.
Right.
And there's one new message, which is Ruth again, calling someday, I hope it's not me, modern day Luddites.
Yeah, I was just referencing Luddites because that's what springs to mind when you talk about a section of society standing up to changes that affect them. And so I was just kind of in my mind just thinking, well, they made their mark on history regardless of the changes because they were just expressing a discontent with what was happening. And so I just see a parallel kind of potentially at least in that.
Yeah, absolutely.
I love the idea, to be honest, Joshua. I think one of the things that we feel very often is what can we do? I mean, obviously, some of us get more involved in others in terms of reading the legislation and in talking to MPs and all the rest of it. But you do sometimes get to a point, don't you? How can we engage? How can we make our mark? How can we say what we're feeling? Because even talking to MPs, it's very limited in terms of the effect and how you can actually change things, particularly if your MP is not somebody who wants to hear what you've got to say. So I think there's possibly a lot of traction with the idea that, if you have if word can get out and if you have people that are willing to embrace that and just say, hang on a minute, this is my no, and this is my way of kind of getting behind and expressing my discontent or my reservations with how things are going. The one thing that we do know is that when there are mass protests, that's when the government takes notice. But if we just lay back and sit down and die and take it all, then obviously they just proceed, don't they? So anything that can actually express that there's a whole section of society that's actually not embracing what they're trying to do. I think that's got to be a good thing. That's my kind of personal thoughts on it, but I don't know what anybody else thinks, but
yeah, I feel similarly, Ruth, and my other slightly selfish view on it is I want to stay off the radar, and if I really, you know, kick off and kind of make myself very known as a home educating family, that puts me in the kind of line of fire, and my children aren't even compulsory school age yet, but I've known since they were born that they weren't going to be going to school, and I want to maintain my freedom with that. And while I'm not known to the LA and not kind of hassled, I want to stay that way. So I want to support, you know, the rising up, but I want to do it in a way that doesn't then give me personal hassle. And I don't know what the future is going to hold in terms of a register coming in the future, potentially mandatory visits, and if I can do something to prevent that affecting my family personally, it's like more, maybe I can prevent that by standing up and making a fuss and not letting it get to that point. But then the flip side of that is it might still happen, and then I'm kind of on a list somewhere that I don't want to be on. So it's hard.
It is very hard for your generation. Some of us around here are greybeards, and our children are adults, but it's our grandchildren who are still being born. And I could stand up at my age, but it would not have the impact of parents. And it is going to be a cost, but I would say, going back to what Joshua said earlier on about, I think none of us want to have to go down such a route. But I think we do have to say, what is the red line point when we say we cannot give in anymore? States, bad actors, whether they're states or individuals, the school bully will take what they can and then come back for more.
Yes.
And when they've taken that, they then come back for more. There's some religious schools who thought they could find a place of balance with Ofsted. They are finding they can't find that place of balance with Ofsted because the state keeps coming back for more. And I really do think there is a wisdom in today's parents really having a thought through strategy, which we, when we were home educating, didn't need. We didn't need that strategy. I think we're now seeing all the signs that I hope we never have to put it into action. But it's foolish now not to have a work through strategy.
I think that there's also a thought, isn't there, that by actually becoming home educators, in a sense, you're putting yourself on the front line, whether or not you're actually, you know, putting your head above the parapet, because that's why, you know, the authorities are worried, because such great numbers are leaving the schools and it's got them really rattled. So there's a sense in which, you know, it's just kind of, if we can harness kind of the numbers and use the fact that there's so many of us, rather than it, you know, it's both, isn't it? It's obviously there's got to be individuals that take a stand, but also the idea that just a swell of numbers can have huge impact. I think that's what we're kind of trying to, is that how you see it, Joshua?
Yes. As I've thought about the deployment of a Parents' Pact or a civil covenant, I have some guardedness about its public use. So I think it's a bit ambiguous. It is on the one hand a public document that one hopes people will come to hear of, because part of its purpose would be to communicate the rights we understand ourselves to have, the responsibilities. That being said, at the heart of a covenant is relationship, and it's interpersonal, it's community-based, it's connecting with one another around something that's precious. And I think it's a catalyst for us to treasure what we've got even more. You know, it's often only when something that you have is threatened that you come to treasure it properly. And so I really do believe that home educators who are in some sense involved in also being apologists for home education will tend to prize what they're doing in a spiraling way, because they'll realize every time they go round to defend what they're doing or to talk to someone about it, that they realize the preciousness of it. All that to say that I see the document, well, perhaps it's not a case of even having one document. Perhaps this is something which is inverting the current trend, which is the trend we've got is centralized state, which on all kinds of subjects and in all kinds of ways is imposing itself on civil society, such that civil society is increasingly muted, like a bass drum stuffed full of duvets. And the response to that can't be another kind of centralizing movement. It can't be another attempt to grab lots of people's data and just raise a fist in a very aggressive and centralized and threatening way. I think the antidote to what we're experiencing from the state is something that's the opposite, that has the wisdom of the grassroots, that has the connection and the covenant and the relationship and the locality, the localism of that. So potentially a covenant is not a single document. Potentially this is something which helps us as communities to shape ourselves in a certain direction.
Does the phrase "a little people's war" chime with anyone?
It sounds good.
I don't know. It sort of made me think of what you were saying about the grassroots. It's not so much one big action undertaken by the general. It's more like the little people all doing something in their particular place. So it's a little people's war, but the effect is big. Yes.
It's Hobbit sized for the Lord of the Rings fans. It's a different kind of strategy. Yeah.
There's one question here from Amy, Joshua, which either you can answer to the last bit. She basically says the same, as that she's in a similar position to Meg, and she did something last year but had to think long and hard before contacting her MP. But she also says, I've been reluctant to contact my local councillor for the same reason. This is a difficulty. Have you anything you've thought about in that area of contacting them? If not, I've got plenty to say, but I'll give you, seeing you're the speaker, I'll give you.
I'll be keen to hear from you, Randall.
Okay, well, Amy, my feeling is this: local councillors are a very good route to change the political temperature. They are more ordinary people. Now, you may get a bad egg as a local councillor who's got a particular ideology they're trying to push in the council chamber, and you might not want to do it. But they are the people, if they realise home educators are ordinary, real, responsible people, when they're at political meetings with MPs and things, and somebody starts being negative about home educators, they're more likely to stand up and say, well, that's not the people I know. But you might not want to go in on the home education front. So a fresh thought for you is, why not try and build up a relationship with your local counsellor using some other issue than home education. And then when you've done that, if you feel comfortable, you can slip in concerns about home education as well. And in fact, looking back of it, I forget when it was, Mary, it was well before COVID, we had to engage with our local counsellor because of the policy here in Shropshire that a lot of families was getting hassles from, but we already knew our local counsellor and she took us serious because she knew us in other contexts. So I've just realised my advice we'd done without realising it. So if there is something else, you know, that crops up that you can find a reason to meet your local counsellor and have a conversation with them and maybe continue it, then at some point you can bring in this as another concern and they already know you without labeling you at that stage. But that's slightly off topic, but there you go. I thought I'd answer it, seeing it was there.
Well, I mean, perhaps that's a way in which the warmth of the civil sphere, we might say, begins to thaw out some of those official contexts, you know, as we bridge those divides and meet people and relate to them in the way you've described.
Yeah.
It's also perhaps sometimes worth thinking about going not on your own, but perhaps taking one or two others with you, kind of safety in numbers idea. So that, I mean, you've got to be a bit careful because you don't want to go with loads and feel that you're ganging up on them. But, you know, if you really don't feel that you can handle it on your own and you've got a friend who would also stand with you, so you go in as a twosome, then there's possibly that might make it easier for you because it's not just one person, you know, you can bounce off each other. And I think it's important as well that you're not going in a too direct. You know, you just, I think when we visited our MP, it was more, our starting point was just, would you like to know a little bit about our home ed, you know, what it looks like, why we decided to do it? And she was all ears, you know, and that reaps benefits down the line. But, you know, I think there's a similar thing, isn't it? You've got to be approachable, but you've got to understand as well that maybe they haven't met anybody else before. So you can actually inform them. So you don't have to go in kind of hammer and tongs and, you know, kind of all up in arms and everything. Sometimes it's just getting to know them and saying, look, you know, we're home educators. Can we tell you what that means? And that can be a really, really precious foundation on which you can build. And you know, as I say, it doesn't have to be all guns blazing. It can just be I just thought I'd like to touch base with you because, you know, we're very often misunderstood and I'd like to just get to know you and just explain, you know, who we are and what we do. And you know, a lot of the time they believe a lot of things that are wrong. There's a lot of myths that they believe, and you can just dispel them just in one kind of half an hour session. They can just go away thinking, wow, you know, I mean, that's our MP did. She said, wow, I never knew all that. You know, thank you for telling me. And it was a complete revelation to her because she'd just never come across anyone before. So it's just worth knowing that, you know, you can actually start the process just at base level, if you like. And maybe just a couple of you, 2 or 3 of you going in gently can actually accomplish a lot without talking about policy or anything you disagree with.
And coming partly back to the point, the best way of doing what we can to prevent this line being crossed where people have to say there is no other option is to engage now.
Yeah.
If you don't want to get there, engage now. And I do believe it's not the big movements in that sense. It's not the organizations that can say we've got so many members. It is individuals relating to individuals that is the things. But yeah, Ruth just said lines are being penciled in now. I think we've got to face up to what we really don't want to think about. Where is that point where I'm saying they're not going to do this to my children?
Yes. Yes, when the word no needs to be pronounced. Yeah, absolutely. And perhaps alongside the development of relationship and making even perhaps baby steps in engagement with more official figures, it does concern me that it seems that there is a minority among home educators who are discussing these issues. And if the time is right for beginning to engage with those who don't know anything about home ed and who are just, really going along with the current modus operandi of our state, which is, I think, to many people increasingly alarming, because we've seen so much of this before in history and even recent history, then surely it's also time to be discussing this more with home educators. Now, home educators, of course, have a lot on their plates, and that will never not be the case. Life is busy, life is hard, especially with young children and old children. I'm advised. But it's not a luxury that we can afford to ignore. It's really the question of, do we believe in the choices we've made or are making on a daily basis? And do we believe that they are so precious as to warrant our best efforts in maintaining them? And of course, remembering also that this is not a selfish move. This is something we're doing, primarily for the sake of our children and for the sake of others who will benefit from the freedoms we're maintaining. And just to, the one thing we're hoping to begin to do here in Scotland is to get, this is something I'm involved with, is to get dads talking to each other, home educating dads, because that's a space that's often not particularly well covered. And, not as an alternative to getting the mums together, but rather as a complement. And in that context, in the context of relationship, we want to know each other first. So we've got that relational glue as a foundation for what might come later. So we're putting the building blocks in place for us to be connected. Because if we don't know each other, and if we're maybe a little suspicious of each other at times, and a little wary of other home educators, who have the reputation sometimes for not being the most conventional of people, well, then it's that relationship building that becomes key perhaps at this stage.
Yeah, we're coming up to the hour, folks. So to keep it on thing and do the recording soon, is there any final comments before we turn the thing off? And if not, Joshua, is there anything, if nobody comes up with anything, is there anything you want to say as a final thing before?
There is a question in the chat, Randall. Could be quite a big one, but I wonder if just one comment on it. It says, Christine says, does anyone have ideas about the safeguarding angle, pushing back on the views of the local authorities, the NHS, the police, on local safeguarding boards? Now, that's a whole big issue, isn't it? But is there just one thing that you'd say about that? Anybody?
Mr. Speaker, you can go first if you.
Well, just a really quick comment, and then I'll give way to my honourable friend, Randall. I think on the question of safeguarding, it's vitally important that we recognise there is a real concern here, and we shoot ourselves in the foot if we don't acknowledge that. And I think if we do start to implement any document like a pact or a covenant, we need to acknowledge the point about safeguarding. But a second thought, very briefly, is that freedoms are never eroded for no reason. There's always a good reason for taking freedom. So I was educated in China for my undergraduate degree, and of course the police force there is called the Public Security Bureau. And I mean, who can object to public security? You study any movement which has seen the erosion of freedom, and there's always a legitimate concern right at the heart there. So we need to discern both the real issue and the danger of real issues grown beyond their proper limits. Now, that's not really an argument about an answer about pushing back, but Randall?
Yeah. The problem with safeguarding is the throwaway phrase, safeguarding is everybody's business. That is true, but it isn't when it comes to the law. I smelt a very big rat, and it hasn't been addressed yet, but I'm hoping it will be with the 2019 guidance. that said safeguarding was the business of local authority education officers and they should respond by issuing SAOs. That is not the legal position. If we are talking about safeguarding, there's 3 levels. I'm not going to go into them in depth, but they all operate with consent. The first one, which is just primary safeguarding, is just what we all do. If you saw a child about to walk out into the road in front of a bus, you'd grab it and stop it. But when it gets that bit more formal, parents have consent to others, to a childminder, to a babysitter, to safeguard their child. The next level is when parents say to the state, I need your help with my child. And that's the secondary level. They obviously then have to consent to the help offered, or they can refuse it. The third level is what is children in risk of serious harm. And that can operate without consent from parents, but it must have the consent of the courts. And it is not every council employee who is charged with that. It is social workers. And they have got to go to the courts to operate safeguarding without consent. And this is a conversation that needs to be had, even with the state. I asked somebody who's got a legal experience, who's got experience of social work, to look at the 2019 thing, guidance, and his comment was to me, he couldn't work out whether they were being mischievous in how the DFE explained that guidance, or whether they just didn't understand it themselves. And it wasn't a benefit of the doubt situation. It was actually, we both came to the conclusion it was so confused they don't understand it. And there is a need to begin to do that. And going back, the driver for all this is, and if you watch the end in particular of my presentation this morning, I get to this area in a sense that the state believes it has got to safeguard individual children from their parents. And part of that safeguarding is making sure that you are not teaching your child what the state thinks is harmful to them. And that is a very big slope. Whatever your views are, if you cannot pass on the wisdom you've gleaned in life to your children, and you've got to stand back while a stranger passes on a wisdom that comes from a collective pot, that is dangerous. And so pushing back, I think we've got to get to grips with the safeguarding issues, make clear there's very clear laws, and safeguarding is always by consent. It is not by enforcement. Just going back to the idea of mandatory interviews with children. What if the child says, I don't want to speak to you? On the other hand, what if a child at school says to a teacher, I really don't want to come to school. Please, can I speak to somebody to tell my parents to home educate me? What would happen then? So, but that's the safeguarding thing for me. We've got to get the arguments in our own heads. And I'm afraid, I think that was one of the issues that should have been tackled in the Portsmouth Judicial Review, and it was completely ignored because the guidance wasn't challenged. And that, thankfully, is now the case, that the judge said the guidance wasn't challenged because it can still be challenged. And even if it's a new version, it gives us something to go on. So I hope, Christine, that helps in what I'm saying. It's a conversation we need to have in wider things, but it is pushing back on this sense of, there's two phrases, safeguarding is everybody's business. That is only half truth. And the other one is the phrase came out of the baby pee, and you'll hear it in many other things. This must never happen again. There's a dream world that these people live in. Like the Children's Commissioner said last year, she wanted 100% attendance from September. Anybody who wants 100% attendance at school is really living on cloud cuckoo land. You can't get it, and you cannot protect every child all the time, even if you put them in a state-run institution. Look at the lack of safeguarding in schools. Look at the historic abuse in children's homes. You can't do it because you're dealing with human nature. I'll get off the soapbox now.
Thank you so much, everyone, for joining this session. It's been a real pleasure to spend this time with you.
Yeah,
there was a question about where people go next. I think one thing to do is to maybe have some conversations in your own context with others who are you're in touch with in your own home education circles. If we're right that the movement begins there, then it would be good to start having those conversations, I think.